Well, good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining us today. And let me first say thank you for the invitation to share with you today. So today I want to talk about a particular topic that has been very important over the last few years, and that is diversity and neurodiversity, and to speak a little bit about the future of what autism advocacy may look like. And so before I get started, I thought it'd be great to allow you a chance to get to know me. So this is a picture of my family. So you see there standing to my right, your left on the screen is my wife, Isabella. We have been married for 20 years this January. And my wife is from Malawi in Africa, and we began dating in college around the age of 18, 19 years old. So we've been together quite a long time. And then on her right, your left on the screen, is our oldest son, Malachi. Malachi will be 16 in June. Then right there in front of my wife is our youngest child in the red there. His name is Miles. Miles is 7 years old, will be 8 years old next month in May. And then to my left and your right on the screen is our middle child, Micaiah. And he is 12 years old. He'll be 13 years old in October. And so that's just a picture of my family. They are a great support system for me through all the things that I'm challenged with, but also all of the successes that I've been able to have. It's been great to have them by my side. So a little bit about me, my story. I was born June 5th, 1978. One of the reasons why I bring that up is because in those days, there was not much, at least not as much education on autism as we know now. So the time frame in which I was born plays a lot into and factors into why I was diagnosed at such a late age. And I'll share more about some of the reasons I believe that is true, but also some of the reasons why I believe that we still have much work to do in this area. It's also important to know that I was raised in a military family. So my father served our country for 20 plus years in the military, which meant that we moved quite a bit. As a matter of fact, when I was diagnosed, one of the things that my therapist who diagnosed me believes that the fact that we moved fairly commonly every 3 or 4 years had a significant role in sort of masking some of the signs that would have gotten me diagnosed at an earlier age, particularly because as we moved from state to state and even living overseas, nobody really expected me to adjust well, especially socially. And so some of the things that would have been significant markers may have been passed off on just the difficulties of constantly moving because I'm in a military family. So my father then was, after a second tour in Germany, was stationed in Fort Bliss, which is in El Paso, Texas. And that's where I finished most of my schooling, middle school and high school. And I graduated in 1996. And then I went to college after graduating college at Concordia University in Wisconsin. I graduated and moved to Atlanta, married my wife, and began a career in ministry around 2001. And then around 2003, I enrolled in seminary and had some successes, but still struggled tremendously trying to find my place in the church world and the faith community as I sought to follow my calling. And then in 2014, I hit what I call the proverbial wall. A lot of the things that I had struggled with my entire life sort of came to a head, and I was seeking for some help in trying to describe the challenges that I always had, that I knew from an early age, around 7 or 8, that there were significant differences between me and other children. But I just didn't have the label or the language to describe what I had experienced my whole life. And so at the age of 36, I finally sought out some help to help me define and describe my life. And after a series of multiple assessments, going through history with my family. Also, my wife had to do some assessments on her observations of my behavior. I was diagnosed on the autism spectrum at age 36. So, what are some of the barriers to my early diagnosis? Because this is a question I get often. I also already mentioned that there's a lack of education and exposure in 1978. And so I grew up and was born in an era where we said things like boys develop slower than girls, and all of the other labels that I was given, like being shy. And there are also occasions where sometimes my behaviors were considered disciplinary issues. And so in 1978, I would have been diagnosed somewhere around 79 or 80. But just the time frame that I was born in has a lot to do with how that diagnosis may have been missed. Also, there are and were a misunderstanding of developmental milestones. And so some of the things that we know now about developmental milestones, we didn't know back then. And so that played a significant factor. And then also there were challenges of constantly relocating. I already alluded to that. And then there's something that I call cultural camouflage. It is something that I think is often misunderstood or maybe not considered at all. And that is, depending on the culture that you were raised in, some of the behaviors may be camouflaged and not necessarily considered to be criteria on the autism spectrum. And so I'll speak a little bit more about that later. So let me start with, as we discuss this, some of the current CDC data on autism. This was released last year, I believe, in 2020. And what the CDC released last year is that autism now is 1 in 54. And so 1 in 54 have been identified with autism. They also noted that boys are more than 4 times as likely to be identified with autism as girls. They identified also that girls identified with autism were more likely to have an intellectual disability than boys. And so 39% of girls were found to also have an intellectual disability that co-occurs with their autism, as opposed to 32% of boys who have a co-occurrence of intellectual disability when they're diagnosed with autism. They also noted that the first developmental screening by 36 months rose from 74% to 84%, and that was among children that were born that were 4 years of age or younger. So a lot of new data came out to help us to understand what the current state of autism is. They also noted that there are improvements in autism identification in Black children. Previous to the current data, there were noted glaring diagnostic gaps between African American and Hispanic or Latino children and white children. But the data that was recently released said that there has been improvements in autism identification in Black children. They also identified that Hispanic children are still identified at lower rates. Hispanic children received evaluations at older ages than white children. So there is still a gap there as far as getting an evaluation. And then perhaps the most interesting of set of data that came out, and what I'll speak more about today, is that Black and Hispanic children without an intellectual disability may not be identified at the same rates as white children. And so, again, we have to understand that oftentimes with autism, there is a co-occurrence of an intellectual disability, but there are cases such as mine where autism is prevalent and there's an absence of a co-occurrence of intellectual disability. So those are the persons that you find, like myself, that tend to be verbal or hyperverbal, but still meet all of the criteria to be considered on the autism spectrum. There tends to not necessarily be a speech delay or a significant speech delay which doesn't also put them in the category of having a co-occurrence of intellectual disability. Now, this is an interesting find because although they report that there are improvements in autism identification in Black children, one of the reasons why I believe that my diagnosis may have been missed and we still continue to have these issues and diagnostic disparities is because of what's noted in the last PowerPoint there, that Black and Hispanic children without an intellectual disability are still not identified at the same rates as white children. So if we take a look at autism and DSM-5, and many of us know this, but I want to review it because I want to tie in and help us to understand what may have been the issue for myself and what continues to be the issue as we look at diagnostic disparities in minority communities. So autism and DSM-5, I took this straight from the DSM-5. I abbreviated some of it for brevity, but there are basic understanding of the tools and the signs that will allow for diagnosis of autism. So I want to review these so that I can help us to understand maybe some of where the gap exists. So the first point is that there's persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts. And this is seen in deficits in social, emotional reciprocity. It's also seen in deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interactions, such as body language, facial expression, voice intonation, all the things that I myself particularly struggle with, because we've all heard the saying, and I'm not quite sure it's 90%, but we've all heard the saying that 90% of all communication is nonverbal. Well, for someone like myself who does not necessarily understand nonverbal communication, or my brain does not translate well nonverbal communication, you can understand if a large percent of how we communicate with one another isn't actually done with words, how challenging that can be for someone like myself, even in the absence of an intellectual disability. It is extremely difficult to navigate a world that communicates nonverbally through most of its communication. It's also seen in deficits in developing and maintaining and understanding relationships. And so as we continue to look at the DSM, we also understand that part of the criteria is restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. That can be seen in a few ways: stereotype or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. One of the things that we often see in young children, and even sometimes in adults myself, is a term called echolaleia, where there is repeated patterns of speech. Usually you will see that in younger children where they'll repeat lines from movies as a way of using that language to interact with the world around them. You also see this in insistence of sameness and inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of verbal or nonverbal behavior. You see that in highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focused. Oftentimes, you will find that many people on the spectrum have a hyper focus on something that interests them, and there's usually an intensity to the level of focus that sometimes can seem abnormal, although I believe when it is coached properly, it can become an asset. And then finally, you see hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So personally, I have challenges with hypersensitivity to sensory aspects. So what that looks like in real life is oftentimes I'm very sensitive to light, to sound, to certain fabric, to certain textures of food. And usually the thing that I struggle with the most is sound and smell. So a great example of that is I often share with people that my life is lived in 4K as opposed to regular HD. So there are sights, sounds, and even things that you feel that I feel at probably 100 times greater rate. Something as simple as walking down the grocery aisle with the laundry detergent can be overwhelming because I can literally smell all of the detergent at the same time in the aisle. But then also sound can be something that I'm hypersensitive to. The best description that I've often given people is when I'm sensory overloaded, particularly with sound, it is like the experience of being concussed. And so there are some days, depending on if I attend an event that puts me in a sensory overload, there are some days where I can literally spend the next day or two in bed because of the intensity of the sight, sounds, and smells around me. And so one of the things that's interesting about autism and DSM-5 is that towards the end of the criteria to categorize autism spectrum disorders, it says two interesting things that I want to put into the conversation so that we understand why it's possible that I was not diagnosed early, in addition to the issues that I already named, but also why it's important for us to pay attention to this during this time frame so that we can develop better tools. So the DSM goes on to say that symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, meaning around the age of 18 months to 2 years. Most of us will, when we're doing regular checkups, we will find our doctors asking questions about our child. I certainly have had that with our children, but the DSM also admits that those may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacities or may be masked by learned strategies. And that's important to realize, because depending on your culture and your context, you may be by your parents and by the social organizations that you frequent, such as church or different clubs, you may, depending on your culture or your ethnicity, being giving additional tools to manage social demands that oftentimes majority children do not have to reach those demands. So for instance, you've heard a lot over the last couple of years where African-American parents often have to have conversations with their children about how they're to behave with figures of authority. And so that's important to pay attention to, because if it's true that those signs may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed their limited capacities, if you have minority children who are being taught additional criteria for managing social demands, their capacity may be larger to handle some of the social demands because they're giving an additional criteria of what it means to interact with people, particularly those who are in authority. And then the DSM also goes into say that these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability. In fact, intellectual or developmental disorder or global developmental delay, intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder frequently co-occur to make comorbid diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. Social communication should be below that expected of a general developmental level. So what that's saying is that while intellectual disability often co-occurs with autism, it may not co-occur with autism, but intellectual disability does not further explain autism. So even in the absence of intellectual disability, the criteria for autism still should be very prevalent and something that is objectively observable. So I want to bring this all together by referencing a sermon from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King that was preached on June 5th, 1966. And I remember this sermon because it was preached on my birthday 12 years before I was born, but 12 years after the Supreme Court rendered it unconstitutional for segregated schools. What's interesting about Dr. King's sermon, because many of us have heard his speeches, but not his sermons, he mentions the role of the faith community in helping to free people from the prejudice and bias that slavery created. And so he wasn't just talking about the role of the faith community and the role of the government in helping to free people from slavery, but there are secondary ramifications that created biases towards people of color that still very much require attention. And so when we look at that all together and we consider that the diagnostic criteria for autism says that a co-occurrence of intellectual disability does not further explain autism, and we consider the fact that there's still diagnostic gaps between African American, Hispanic children, and white children who do not have an intellectual disability, in theory, what we are witnessing is children who are of color who display the same behaviors in theory, absent of an intellectual disability, that should get them assessed and observed and diagnosed with autism. But as Dr. King said, there are still some biases that are the residue of some of the history of the country. So what am I saying? That part of the issue, why I may not have been diagnosed and why there's still diagnostic gaps, is that the behaviors that are displayed in minority children that are the exact same behaviors that should get them assessed and diagnosed with autism are oftentimes interpreted as something different than they're interpreted in white children. Because if intellectual disability does not further explain autism, then in theory, by science and just by pure observation, those behaviors should be the same and there should be no diagnostic gap. The only explanation is that those behaviors are being interpreted as something different. And so what we have to do then is then consider a lot of the cultural influence on our ability to close that gap and to be better at diagnosing our children of color. Here's what Courtney Newberry says about autism research. She says that most autism research originates in the West, and we have a particular view of what autism is, a particular view about how children behave and interact with adults. Other cultures might have very different expectations of how children behave. And you can read that. There's a reference there in Spectrum News. What she is saying is something that I think becomes the missing link in the gap that causes persons like myself, even though I was born in the late 70s, and even children today who are children of color, to continue to struggle with getting the assessment and the early intervention that is needed, because most of the research originates with people from the majority culture, namely young white males. And so all of the criteria has been shaped based on one cultural perspective of what autism may look like, which leads to the exact same behaviors distributed and displayed in children of color being interpreted as something completely different, when in fact, it very well may be autism. So we have to then consider what are some cultural factors that need to be considered as we look at the future of what autism research and diagnostic criteria should look like. Well, cultural factors are those that contribute to how autism is experienced and how autism is displayed. So this comes from the Children's Hospital of LA, and they've done some significant work on there. There's a reference there at the bottom of the slide, but they contend that issues such as language, geographic location, religion, nationality, economic status, gender, beliefs and value, family structure, and ethnicity all play a significant role in the shaping and understanding of various cultures and subcultures. And so if you think about it, if all of the diagnostic criteria was developed by observing one particular culture and gender, there are a number of things that have been left out of the criteria that helps us to understand autism better as it relates to different cultures, ethnicities, and also gender. And so again, language, geographic location, religion, all of those things influence how children behave, how those behaviors are displayed. And again, sometimes even as a minority in this country, you're given an additional hidden curriculum on how to behave and how to interact with people because of your minority status. So again, language, geographic location, religion, nationality, economic status, gender, beliefs and values, family structure, and ethnicity all play a significant role in understanding culture, which is not always easily translated to how we understand autism in communities of color. So then we have to consider ethnicity, culture, and autism and how it all plays together. ethnicity and culture can first impact how autism is understood. What that means is that from culture to culture, even within our country, autism might not be understood in the same way as the current diagnostic criteria is described. So, for example, issues such as eye contact, that tends to be overwhelming understanding of how autism can be discovered. Those things may not be as important to different cultures. Therefore, it doesn't translate to that culture why a child making eye contact with people is a significant issue that may need to be observed and then later on addressed. There are also cultural differences can impact how autism is experienced. And so similarly to how ethnicity and culture can impact how it's understood, it can also impact how it is experienced. So a great example of that, again, is eye contact. If that is not an important cultural value for a certain segment of the population, then how that family or caregivers experience what very well be autism may be much different than how it's described in the criteria. And then cultural differences often exist within the same ethnicity. So those are things that we must pay attention to. And then finally, culture impacts nonverbal communication, other behaviors. So if it's true that one of the significant factors in being able to diagnose autism is the ability to verbally communicate, we also have to take into consideration how culture impacts the use of nonverbal communication and other behaviors. Are there ways that different cultures view nonverbal communication in different ways, and also other behaviors? Oftentimes, those things are not actually considered in the current diagnostic criteria. So, a path to understanding diversity in neurodiversity begins with understanding the pattern that has been established over the years. So, according to the United Nations, people with disabilities are the largest minority group in the world. The ADA of 1990 was actually patterned after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which we know was primarily born out of the African American church. In addition to the end of end of segregation, the Civil Rights Act created a path to diversity and inclusion. And in many ways, we can learn from the civil rights movement as they sought to find ways to be more inclusive of communities of color as a pathway to help us to understand the need for diversity within the autism community, so that we can become better at diagnosing and providing early intervention for children of color. So access and autism advocacy. Diversity is about creating access. So in the beginning of this talk, I told you that the talk was about diversity and neurodiversity. And because we now understand that there's still significant gaps between various ethnicities and their ability to get early access and early intervention, then we understand that we have a diversity issue even within the autism community, which may suggest why, again, persons like myself, and we have continually seeing diagnostic gaps because diversity within our community of autism has become an issue. So studies have shown that an increase in diversity actually increases group learning, and that's done by Bantel and Jackson, a group that studies organizations and diversity. And what they found is that increasing diversity actually increases group learning. So when there are diverse teams, they benefit from a wide range of resources, ideas, and experience. And they also know that non-diverse groups find it harder to keep learning because less and less unique information is being brought into the group. So the link there from the beginning of this talk to now is to show that there's still a wide gap in diagnosis for children of color, which then makes it more difficult to bring in increased group learning into the autism community as a whole, because we're not bringing in the amount of new resources, ideas, and experience from different cultures to help bolster and to help challenge the current diagnostic criteria, so that we can help to understand how we're missing so many of our children like myself. And so Bantel and Jackson says that non-diverse groups find it harder to keep learning because less and less unique information is actually being brought to the group. So, sort of the future of what I believe autism advocacy needs to be is that the disability community is a large contributor to increase learning on a global scale. So, as we are, as a country, seeking to become more inclusive and diverse, most of that has been racially and ethnically. But I believe the disability community at large can be a large contributor to the increased learning on a global scale. So, remember, as we are trying to become more diverse as a country, we need more and more diverse voices and experiences to help bring new learning to our group so that it continues to help open up the doors for more minority communities. The autism community within the disability community is largely anchored in the ideals of diversity because of neurodiversity. So I contend that the autism community actually can lead the way in creating a better world because one of the core ideas of the autism community is neurodiversity, which is rooted in diversity. However, that means that we in the autism community need to find ways to become more diverse and to bring in different voices that help to increase our learning so that we can transition from diagnostic criteria that is based mainly on the majority culture to understanding culture and ethnicity in the ways that it influences how autism experienced and how autism is viewed so that we can widen the understanding of what it means to be a diverse community. In doing so, then we are able to bring new learning to the larger disability community and ultimately to the larger conversation of diversity and inclusion in our country. So the future of autism advocacy, as I see it, is to develop diversity-based diagnostic tools that we should study and learn cultural norms of varying ethnicities so that we can use that information to translate it into the current diagnostic criteria so that it becomes more diverse and also ethnically, racially, and culturally sensitive so that we can increase our learning. And also, by increasing our learning, we can become better at early intervention, and children like myself won't be found lost in the gap. So we also have to acknowledge nonverbal communication barriers. Again, from culture to culture, from ethnicity to ethnicity, nonverbal communication may mean something different. And so we need to acknowledge what those barriers are to understanding the differences between cultures and their expression of and their reception to nonverbal communication. Then we need to determine appropriate behavior within cultural contexts. Every behavior listed in the diagnostic criteria is not always deemed as inappropriate behavior in certain cultural contexts. Again, the explanation about eye contact in some cultures, that's not always considered inappropriate behavior not to have eye contact with the person that you're speaking with. And so we need to determine better what appropriate behavior looks like within cultural contexts so that the blanket statements that are often found in a current diagnostic criteria doesn't cause for children like myself and even children in the future to miss out on early intervention and assessment because we don't understand that those behaviors are not always valuable within cultural contexts. And so we also need to use new data to increase diagnostic awareness among minorities. So as we are getting better at becoming culturally and ethnically sensitive, then we can use the data of the increase of diagnosis of children of color to help us to become more aware of how to increase and close the gap of minority children who are being sometimes falling through the cracks of diagnostic criteria because we have not been as culturally sensitive as we could be in helping to understand how to disseminate that information. So that new data, as we increase the diagnosis and close that gap, helps to bring awareness amongst minority communities. And then also create more platforms for persons of color. One of the things that I discovered after I was diagnosed, I wanted to attend conferences so that I could learn more about autism and learn more about myself. But what I discovered is that Many of the mainstream conferences did not have keynote speakers or facilitators that are people of color. And so what ends up happening is that those tend to not be considered resources that families of different ethnicities lean into because they don't see persons who look like them. And so we have to understand that statistics can be married to stories. What we need is to create more platforms for people of color so that those statistics that I talked about earlier can be transformed into stories that will relate to persons of different ethnicities and cultures. And then increased exposure to autism and developmental disabilities in minority communities. Oftentimes, as I've done my research and as I've traveled and spoke at different conferences, I learned from minority families that there's oftentimes not enough exposure, but there's also not enough resources in the communities that they live in. And so the future should push us to increase exposure, but also to help translate common diagnostic criteria into culturally accessible language. Everything that's on the diagnostic criteria and everything that your doctor may or may not be reviewing with you as your children are coming along the age of 18 months or 2 years may not translate into culturally accessible language. So, for example, I was not diagnosed until I was age 36, and it was because of as I was doing my doctorate, I was asked to have 7 people who know me well to do an assessment. And a gentleman who I really respected, who I worked with at the time, wrote in his assessment of me, Lamar has a hard time picking up on social cues. Lamar gets laser focused on one task at a time. And his evaluation of me that was for a school project literally read like the diagnostic criteria. Here's my point. Up until the age of 36, I had no idea what a social cue was. I had never heard that language. And so, like most people, when you don't understand something, you Google it. So I use that as an example to say that even growing up, terms like social cues, body language, those types of things are not always culturally accessible language. I myself nor my family knew that there was such a thing. I didn't understand what a social cue meant, and I had to do my own research to be able to understand what are you trying to communicate by using language that points towards a possible diagnosis. It was a totally foreign term. And I found that many times some of the current diagnostic criteria and language are it's not always culturally accessible. So some of the children of color and minority families may not be properly assessing or understanding what to look for because the language that is used does not always translate into something that they understand. So, again, I want to thank you for the opportunity and for giving me this chance to just share with you a little bit of my journey, why I believe I may have flown under the radar, and why it's important for us to address some of these issues so that children like myself do not continue to fall under the radar and that we are able to get them early intervention so that their life can be as successful and as fruitful as possible. So thank you again for this opportunity. And if there are any questions, you can always find me. The best way is to locate me at my website, which is autismpastor.com. And from there, you can find my blogs, articles, books, and any other information that may be important to you. Again, thank you for your time.